Going to try to keep this relatively brief and focused, but it is important to offer some comments on what is happening in Georgia today. And first, I should say that many of you know that I supported this Georgian Dream government when it tried to come to power in 2012, when it did come to power in that election. I believed that breaking the grip that the United National Movement had on Georgian political life was essential for preserving the hope for democratic advance in Georgia. I still, looking back, believe that was the right decision. However, it is clear over the course of the now decade that the Georgian Dream has been in power, longer than the United National Movement was in power, that they are not interested in moving democracy forward. At first, it was enough simply to not be the United National Movement, and that remains their strongest electoral appeal to this day. But it is also now clear that the raison d'etre of this regime is to be in power tomorrow, next week, next month. They are not interested in trying to solve the myriad problems facing Georgia. They are not interested in trying to support Ukraine and the United States at this moment of the Russia-Ukraine war. They are interested in staying in power. But even then, I am bewildered by this foreign agents law, which is the impetus for the events we are seeing in Georgia today. Despite what the Georgian government has said, the foreign agents law is not the same as the FARA law in the United States. That simply isn't the case. And while the Georgian people do have a right to know who is funding which NGOs, to put these kind of restrictions, these kind of requirements on these NGOs is a setback to the cause of liberal democracy. And I would highlight that this is particularly true in a country like Georgia, which has a long history of one-party dominance of government, whether it be the Georgian Dream, the United National Movement, or the Citizens United of Georgia Party. Because in those kind of countries, civil society is the only check on governmental power, even if that government is elected democratically. Once they are in power, without checks, the possibility of moving towards authoritarianism are just too great. And without foreign assistance, those NGOs cannot survive, cannot be strong enough to act as a functioning check on the Georgian government. It also should be noted, as it has been over and over again, that this is not some idea that was hatched in the Georgian parliament by the prime minister, by Irakli Kobakhidze or someone like that. This is an idea that was initially hatched in Moscow and has been picked up by a number of Russia's allies. Those allies are not on the side of democracy. They are on the side of authoritarianism. This law is not a bringing the FARA law to the Foreign Agent Registration Act, for those who don't know, to Georgia. It is bringing a Russian frame for addressing civil society to Georgia. And that would be devastating, and if it is implemented, will be devastating for Georgia's politics and for Georgian democracy. But I would also note that the mass demonstrations that we are seeing on the streets of Tbilisi today, and of course I'm in New York, not Georgia, but I am talking to people there pretty regularly throughout the day, and the efforts to disrupt those, to break up those demonstrations by the Georgian state, by the Georgian government, by the Georgian Dream, are significant. And the main reason for that is that the Georgian Dream, over its decade in power, we have had demonstrations before. We have seen demonstrations before. We have seen calls for the Georgian government to resign and have snap elections. But those have always been put in a partisan frame. It was always the United National Movement and their supporters calling for this. And as long as that is who was at the front, the Georgian Dream was always going to be fine. But that is not the case now. This is Georgian civil society very broadly rising up and trying to demand that Georgia not go backwards on liberalism and not go backwards on democracy. And the Georgian Dream can no longer point and say, look, this is just Misha and his cronies. This is just the National Movement and his cronies. This is Vano Merabishvili and his cronies. They can't say that about what's happening now. And yet they are using fire hoses. They are using other tools to break up these demonstrations. And that may lead to more widespread violence and ultimately to destabilize Georgia. And while it is essential to keep Georgia on some kind of a track towards democratic reform, destabilizing Georgia could be devastating and a real setback. And the real winner there, as you all know now, would be Moscow. So my hope is that Georgia finds a way to get through this, that there is not greater violence, and that while if there is instability, if there is destability, it leads to more democracy, not a crackdown. Because right now, the Georgian Dream government have backed themselves into a corner. This is an unforced error. They didn't need to do this. They benefit very little from doing this. And where things stand today, they are running out of options. Their major option is to continue this crackdown after today and move Georgia towards a more authoritarian regime. Not the regime that so many in the opposition have been accusing this government of being, but an authoritarian regime, and one that inevitably leans towards Russia. And my sense is that if the Georgian Dream tries to take Georgia even more quickly in that direction, it will not be able to survive as a regime.